Now we are entering into our second phase of today's conference, where we are going to talk about some research, and also if Jim comes on board on time, we are also going to talk about heirs property on Indian lands, and it's very complicated there just to start with. So our first speaker for today is Dr. Noah Goyke. Noah Goyke was a PhD student here in Waterloo School of Forestry and Natural Resources. And then he graduated on this project, published some good quality work, and now he's a teaching fellow at Northland College, Wisconsin. And I was talking to Noah in the morning. He told me temperature where he is minus 15 Fahrenheit. So Noah, I admire your bravery, especially on such a cold day. I would have done nothing except sitting in my house. So with this thing, Noah, let's start having your presentation.
All right, thanks, Puneet. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to anyone who's joining us just now. As Puneet said, I'm Dr. Noah Goyke. I'll have the privilege to speak to all of you for a few minutes about some of the work that I've been doing on this SARE grant, or that I've done on this SARE grant. And I want to highlight some key takeaways from the work, both on diverse outlooks and also the economic prospects for African-American forest landowners. The first thing I want to address is the Black forest landowner. And if I were doing this in person, which I'm not for obvious reasons, I would have said that the Black forest landowner in air quotes. Why? Because from my point of view, the Black forest landowner is a myth. And what do I mean by that, right? I mean, it's unhelpful for forest professionals to think of African-American forest landowners as sort of the quote unquote Black landowner, as if all African-Americans were the same, right? That's just not right. The reality is that African-American forest landowners are incredibly diverse, right? Some of our research, which can be found in the publication listed below, provides a snapshot of that diversity. We found 20% of African-American forest landowners are women, 48% are retirement age, a third have a college degree, they're veterans, they're farmers, teachers, and a lot of other people. Some own a few acres, 10 or less. Some have a back 40. Others have their own 100-acre wood or properties that are much larger. A quarter of African-American forest landowners have heirs property, about a fifth are absentee owners. And with those diverse backgrounds, those diverse experiences, it shouldn't surprise anyone that they also have diverse management goals. In research detailed in this publication, we interviewed African-American forest landowners to understand those goals and the motivations behind them. While each landowner had a unique story to tell, we were able to, in some ways, group their goals and motivations into 5 management styles. The first management style is the sustainable forest manager. These landowners are interested in a balance of forestry for profit and conservation, especially conservation so that the land is in good condition for future generations, both to inherit and also to profit from in the future. In the words of one landowner who fit into this management style, pines are an investment in the future, an investment in the property and the future. A second management style that we found is the back 40, or that's what we called them. These landowners were interested in recreation and also having forestry to diversify their portfolio. In the words of one landowner, I want to diversify the property, maybe the front in forestry for profit and farming in the back. The front of the property was pretty hilly, the back was flatter, more suitable for row crop. The third management style that we sort of ran into was what we called the land use pragmatist. These landowners were interested in maximizing the economic return of the land. That makes a lot of sense. Conservation, which has a cost, let's be honest, didn't align with their management goals. It's not that they didn't want to do conservation or didn't agree with it, it just didn't fit their strategy. And they also recognized that the return for row crops other than timber, while not necessarily higher, is definitely faster. And so they were interested in turning their forest land into other uses post-harvest. One landowner expressed this precisely when they said, trees, I prefer it all in pasture. The trees are okay. I like to look at them. I like the idea of conservation, but it's a long drawn out process. it might take 25 years or more. A fourth management style was the recreationalist. These landowners had small properties usually, and they were primarily interested in the opportunity to go out and enjoy their land, to recreate, and also just as a place of refuge, a place really of peace and quiet. And that was the purpose of owning forested property. And finally, we had some undecided landowners. They weren't quite sure what to do. And as often as not, I think they were looking for someone to help them figure out what was possible. I like to think of these undecided landowners as an opportunity, right, for forest professionals, for all of us, not to give someone a copy and paste management plan, but I think it's a great opportunity to help someone discover something about themselves through forestry. And just as we've been talking about these diverse management styles, diverse goals, diverse outlooks, African-American forest landowners have diverse ideas about the future of their land. And in the research detailed in the publication below, it's the third publication, we identified three general outlooks that pretty well describe the most popular ideas, right? Everyone has a unique story, but we're able to sort of group people around these three basic outlooks. The first we call the family forest manager. I want to stress that word, family. These landowners were focused on managing their forests for income and future generations, but really had an eye on the past, on the historic struggle of African Americans, both in their own family and other African Americans, the struggle they had to acquire land and to pass on land that motivated them wanting to keep land in the family towards the future. One landowner told us, I used to hear my dad say how hard it was on them to purchase the land, which he eventually did against the odds. Keeping this land in our family is important, no matter what. Okay. But a second outlook was the family forest investor. These were landowners who were all about the economic potential of their forest land. And a lot of them, maybe unfortunately, were pessimistic about keeping the land in the family. In the words of one landowner, really this place was an investment for me. My kids are in the city, referring to Atlanta. They abhor this place. And I think that's a reality for a lot of families who own forest land, is maybe the next generation isn't interested in being forest landowners. Finally, there was a group we called the family forest stewards. These landowners were totally focused on keeping the land in the family. That was the goal. Many with this outlook actually explicitly rejected the idea that their forest land could be profitable. But I want to add that this research in this publication, also some of the research we did earlier, demonstrates for a lot of landowners a clear connection between legacy goals, wanting to keep the land in the family, and management activity, those BMPs. So sometimes I think that family forest stewards want to engage with forestry, right? They want to be good stewards of the land. They want to manage their land properly, but they don't have an explicit goal of maximizing income. It's just a different way of thinking about why we manage them. Regardless of management style and legacy outlook, every forest landowner is going to benefit from income, right? I'd imagine revenue is important for those who want to pass on their land, and showing their heirs the economic potential of timberland is going to increase that future generation's interest. Some researchers have made a convincing case that economic arguments are a good way to motivate people to take that first step towards resolving their heirs' property issues. At a minimum, forest income should let landowners, and especially heirs' property owners, cover their tax burden and hopefully avoid losing their land to a tax sale. While keeping the diversity of African American forest landowners in mind, all those diverse management styles, legacy outlooks, we conducted 4 economic case studies to look at the income potential on forest land. You can find the details in the published article listed below. In each of the 4 cases, we considered 2 management scenarios. One we called BAU, business as usual, which was essentially doing nothing. The other, AFM, active forest management, the landowners would be applying hypothetically regeneration and tending treatments. They'd be going out and doing stuff to make their trees grow better. Additionally, we considered each management scenario from a clear title and an heirs property perspective. In the clear title perspective, we applied the fair use tax burden of conservation use valuation assessment. So that's a lower property tax. In heirs property, which we've seen are not usually eligible for these tax program enrollments, we applied the best use taxes. Okay, so that's a lot higher tax burden for these lands. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see the management and title combinations laid out graphically, just to get you an idea of what we're talking about here. So there's 4 combinations total, right? And 4 landowners for a total of 16 analyses. The scenarios were analyzed using the land expectation valuation method. If that was a positive value, that means the property was profitable, and we considered it maybe a good candidate for being inherited, or at least not for being lost to a tax sale. If that value, though, of the analysis was negative, we considered the property to be not profitable and a candidate for loss. How did we do that? In the business as usual scenario, the only associated costs were tax and a maintenance cost. Income was from a final timber harvest. In this scenario, only natural pine was considered timber producing land. All of the other land covers were non-timber land. So your mixed pine hardwoods, your hardwoods, open pastures and the like. We also had some properties with water, open water, wetlands, streams, and developed land. It's true that technically mixed pine hardwood and hardwood stands can be considered timber producing land, but in the scenarios we analyzed, they weren't really yielding a sufficient volume of pine to attract a logger, and none of the landowners that I spoke with were selling hardwood. In the active forest management scenario, the associated costs included taxes, maintenance, site prep, tending treatments, and income was from the harvest plus the thinning, and we heard about thinnings earlier. If you look at the right-hand side, you'll see that natural pine was converted to pine plantations, as was the mixed hardwood pine. So we're going to convert this from sort of the natural state into these pine plantations, which are much more productive. The other land was still considered non-timber land. Just considering timberland, forestry at a per profitable acre was profitable, right? With 2 trends. First, land with clear title was more profitable than land in heirs property due to the lower tax burden. Second, active forest management was also more profitable than business as usual. That shouldn't be unexpected, right? Timber should generate income. We saw that earlier. Higher costs, higher taxes should lead to lower profits. And active management, going out and doing the regeneration and tending treatments, should produce higher returns. So it's an insufficient analysis, right? This stands to reason, but profitability at the property level and land retention depends not on the ability of forest land to generate income, but of the ability of the forest land on the property to generate sufficient income to offset the entire property tax burden, right? So we're not just paying for our forest acres, we've got to pay for the whole property, all that water, wetlands, pastures, etc. To determine if the property was profitable, we added the positive value of timberland to the negative value of non-timberland. So those hardwoods, those wetlands, we're not selling timber from them, so they're not generating income, but we still owe taxes on that land. In the business as usual scenario, only natural pine was considered timberland, right? The pasture, mixed pine hardwoods, wetlands, etc., was considered non-timberland. In the active forest management scenario, we're doing regeneration, tending treatments, plantation pine was considered timberland, while all the other lands, pastures, wetlands, etc., were considered non-timberland. At the property level, active forest management was substantially more profitable than business as usual. Going out, managing your trees is much more profitable. Even for heirs property, active forest management is a path to profitability, even with that higher tax burden, and hopefully a path to land retention. Granted, there are a lot of barriers to active forest management on heirs property, a big one being getting the family to come together and agree to do it. Clear title was more profitable compared to heirs property, regardless of the management scenario. In all 4 cases, heirs property with that higher tax burden in a business as usual management, just letting the pines come up on their own with no help from the landowner, was a money loser. It was not profitable. And those properties were the ones we considered most at risk for being lost, either to tax sales or other reasons. Some of the properties, even with the lower tax burden of conservation use ownership, the business as usual scenario was not enough. You weren't generating enough income just from those natural pine stands to offset the property tax cost. I think there's several things that we can collectively take away from these 4 research publications. In the short term, I think this research suggests the importance of considering the cases of individual landowners and finding management that fits their needs. Are they living on the property? Are they absentee owners, for example? And I think there's an opportunity to listen to landowners and find a way to address their different management styles, their different goals, their different motivations, while also pointing out the hard reality of the economics and maybe finding a way to make forest management profitable while meeting landowner goals. I think that it's important for us all as forest professionals to keep in mind that it's income that's going to let landowners pursue their goals. And so if we can reframe maybe timber sales, not as the goal, but as a means of achieving the goal, be that keeping the land in the family, be that resolving heirs property issues, I think we've really got a strong case to make to encourage people to be active about their timber management. In the long term, I hope that these economic analysis and tools like them that people do in the future will really encourage those with heirs property issues to resolve those issues. And also, I hope that this is a tool that landowners currently can bring to their heirs, to that next generation, and help start a dialogue. Forestry can be profitable, land can be profitable, and hopefully the next generation can be interested in that opportunity. Because if they're not, we're not going to keep land in African American families, and I don't think we're going to keep forest land in forest long term. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but I'm really excited about opportunities in the future as well. Before finishing this presentation, I want to highlight several others who played an important role in the research: Dr. Puneet Dwivedi, Dr. Sarah Hishner, and John Shalhaz. They're both going to share shortly. Mr. Mark Thomas in Fort Valley State University Extension. Of course, all the participating landowners could not have done any of this without them. And Southern SARE, who funded the research. I don't know if we're taking questions now or if we're all going to take questions together at the end. But either way, thank you all for listening.
So thanks, Noah. I think my plan is to take questions at the end because it will be good to see what all the research that we have done and what we have found so that people can make their mind in terms of what question they can ask, because I'm sure if there are some questions, John might be answering them in his talk, and same goes with Sarah. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
And Noah, this being said, you were my PhD student, and I really enjoyed working with you, and looking forward to more collaborations in the future.
Likewise.
Okay, thanks, Noah. So our next speaker is Dr. John Shalhaz, and he's joining us from Athens, Georgia. So John, your turn.
Thank you, Puneet, and thank you, Noah, for beginning the process of talking about the SARE research project. You can hear me, right, Puneet?
Yes, you're all
okay.
set.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about another aspect of the research that was done in this same project. Just to give a little introduction, we know there's a long historical pattern of African American underengagement in forestry, and going back to 1985, really, when the first issue on African Americans in forestry was in the Journal of Forestry. There were 3 main obstacles identified: heirs property, a limited connection to forestry, and difficulties in participating in conservation incentive programs. So our idea is that we can improve our knowledge and practice by focusing research specifically on the aspect related to forestry engagement. Some of the other research has sort of pulled out these different factors, and you can put those in a logit model and some other things and see what factors are important. But what I want to talk about today is a slightly different approach, where we try to focus on the stories that people tell about their engagement with forestry, which are also complex and nuanced, and also some of these individual factors can cut both ways. And so that's why I think the stories are important. To talk about what we did qualitative interviews. We did a purposive sample where we tried to capture a diversity of different types of African-American forest owners. We were introduced to about half of them through Fort Valley State University Extension Program, and the other half came by participating in outreach workshops, talking to churches, and sort of using our professional contacts. We tried to interview people on the land in person when we could. We did some by telephone because of absentee landowners, but we did whatever method we could do to talk to landowners. Through that, we're able to get 40 qualitative interviews, which included a great diversity of different kinds of people. Here's just some statistics about the kinds of people that we talked to. Most were over 50. We didn't get as many female owners as we have in other research that we've done in other states, but about a third of the interviewees included a female owner. They were pretty well educated, but not, if you're familiar with our other research in Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, the education level was not as high. Most people had plenty of acres to engage in forestry. 3/4 held at least 20 acres. 2/3 of them held more than 50 acres. We talked about the importance of that earlier with some of the other panelists. About half had inherited land, about a third had heirs property. Only 10% earned profit from their land. So people were not making money from their land. Some people were breaking even, but for about 40%, it was still costing them money to own land. About a third had some engagement in a variety of forestry things. Interestingly enough, timber harvesting, about half had sold timber, and about half had involved in a cost share program. And I think, as I'll explain a little later, that a high percentage in cost share was because we interviewed a lot of farmers. So what we really focused qualitatively about how people talked about forestry and the obstacles and the ways that they engaged with it. And I want to organize a presentation in 5 themes: joint ownership and disagreement, family legacy, farming and forestry, experience and social relationships, and risk versus investment. To focus in on the first one, joint ownership and a disagreement, I don't want to in any way suggest that heirs property is not an important topic, but we found that an underlying issue behind difficulties in resolving heirs property was the difficulty for multiple owners coming together to some sort of agreement with what they wanted to do with their land. That also prevents the resolution of heirs property. It prevents sustainable forest management, like we talked about before in the earlier session. A couple of things we found is some people found that they prioritize family harmony over action, or they just procrastinated because the family wanted to talk about it and come to an agreement together. It's good to have family harmony, but it's also good to move on and come to agreement. And a very common pattern that's already been talked about today is when one person cuts timber and sells it and they don't share the proceeds with other people, that can sow the seeds of family disagreement for a long time. But we also found ways that people dealt with heirs property, sometimes by designating an administrator with decision-making property, but that requires a family coming together in some sort of an agreement to do that. If that's still a difficult thing, we find that one way people are able to do that, sometimes if an outside technical expert, someone from outside the family can come in and talk about forestry with the family, it's not coming from one of the family members, so people aren't, sensitive to whose interest is being served. And that can help sort of jumpstart this process of breaking down disagreement. On the more positive side, most people that have heirs property have family land, and family land is very important to people. People both look back to their earlier generations that acquired that land, and they want to honor them, and they also want to pass the land on to the next generation. And within those family stories, there were oftentimes people got together in the past to plant trees. Sometimes more recently, people got together to hunt and do recreation. Sometimes one family member takes an initiative and starts talking to NRCS, and then brings that to the family. But this history of doing things together can help people come together once again. The other positive thing is that families working in professional occupations off the land can plant trees for income, or they can use the land for getting the family together for recreation. So forestry is a good fit, as has already been mentioned, for people that have jobs off the land and for people that are absentee landowners. Okay. As I mentioned before, we talked to more farmers in this research than we have in other research that we've done. It's probably not surprising that history of African American land ownership in the South is actually rooted in farming and not very well connected with forestry, because most of the opportunities to be involved in forestry were with the more labor intensive sides of forestry, like pulpwooding and turpentine. And I think we found when you talk to farmers, they're very utilitarian. They tend to like their farming aspect more than their trees, but they see forests as a way to come in and help them balance the risk that's associated with farmers. The other thing that's happened that's already been talked about is that farmers are very active managers, and they want to continue to be active managers even if they stop farming, and trees provide them an opportunity to do that. If you're a forestry person, as I am, the only negative thing about farmers and forestry, and it's not really a bad thing from their perspective, is they're very interested in tree crops like pecans, blueberries, and peaches that can compete with forestry and provide quicker returns, but also require better labor investment. So I'm not saying these are bad things. They're good for some people, and for some people they'd rather have the more hands-off opportunities associated with forestry. In terms of experience in social relationships, we did find that people often had connections to family and neighbors that had been involved in forestry. Very few people involved in forestry organizations. If people were involved in some sort of land management related organization, it was related to farming or to cattle for the most part. But farmers often had experience with NRCS and conservation programs. They knew the people, they knew the process, so they already kind of have a leg up in terms of getting involved in the forestry related conservation programs. And we found some people that were able to come in with little experience and do their research, meet and vet assistance providers, experiment with forestry, but that's just a whole lot easier for larger landowners, much harder for smaller landowners. We did find little use of forestry providers outside of these conservation programs. There's a long history of allowing natural regeneration and doing opportunistic harvests of trees, which produces lower returns, but also has lower investments. But the advantage of that is at least that people are familiar with trees and forestry, and some of those people, as they learn more about more typical forest management processes that people use now, are able to make the switch over to those. Okay, and sort of finally, the issue that I want to talk about is, we found, really two different perspectives on forestry. Some people who had bad experience, they'd gotten pine beetles, they'd planted trees that hadn't survived, they had fire, just really see forestry as being a high risk sort of option that also requires a lot of investment for a return much further down the line. But other people see it as an investment comparable or better to stocks, for example. And experience and knowledge are kind of what makes the difference. And the key is how to get people experience and get started along the process of engaging in forestry. Just to sort of summarize, there are certain aspects that hinder forestry engagement: not having enough land, complex ownership and heirs property, lack of family agreement, perception of risk due to lack of knowledge and experience, and also isolation from a forestry community. Forestry engagement is much more likely when there's a long-term family vision for the land. There's a formal land and forestry decision-making structure. People are farmers and active land managers and have some forest management experience, and they know someone to turn to for some advice. Even though I divided this up into 5 things, I think the important thing is that there are opportunities and leverage points that work across these different things. If the family can come together and begin to work together, they can overcome heirs property and get involved in active management, get a return from the land, and the outside natural resource professionals can play a really important role in facilitating that process. There are a variety of different ways that people manage their forests, but the traditional approaches, while providing less return, can provide a gateway to forestry engagement, and comfort level increases with experience. And ultimately, we really are working towards building a forestry community among African American landowners. And I think a part of the thing that moves people along are examples and stories about things like how families have organized themselves, how they've gotten engaged in sustainable forest management, and how forestry can turn out to be an investment. So stories like Joe Hamilton and the other landowners have talked about, it's better to hear it from another landowner than it is from a professional, although the professionals can really come in and provide some of the details. All right, that's all I have.
Thanks a lot, John. So our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Hishner. Somehow her internet is not functioning today only properly. So what I have decided, or what we have decided, is that I'm going to play her recorded presentation for you guys. And then I think we'll have sufficient time to have a good, proper Q&A, right? So with this, let me share my screen, and hopefully it will work on my side, because as you know, when you want, it never works. So, hi, I'm Sarah. Okay, at least one thing is working. Let me share my screen. Optimize, share videos. Okay, so share. So hopefully you can see it now. Close this guy up and play the video.
Sarah Hishner, a cultural anthropologist at University of Georgia, and today I'm going to be presenting some work I've been doing over the past several years with Black landowners across the southeastern United States with colleagues John Shalhaz, Punit Dwivedi, Mark Thomas, Noah Goike, and others, including extension agents, foresters, nonprofits, and over 100 landowners that we've interviewed. Most of this research was conducted with John Shalhaz, also an anthropologist, and we asked these landowners questions about the history of their land, their management goals, and obstacles they face in achieving these goals. We also asked more personal questions that aim to learn more about the sentimental attachments to land through special memories of the land and emotions and values that guide their decision-making processes. We like to ask open-ended questions and allow people to tell us what they think is important and relevant. So we hear a lot of stories, and it's our job to relay those stories in a coherent way. So today I'm going to briefly summarize some of the main things we heard people say when they talk about the importance of their family land. We found that these main themes fit well within the context of cultural landscapes, and that one significant element was the presence, and in many cases resolution, of heirs property. As we know, this is a common ownership challenge for many Black families and has led to a loss of Black-owned land and fragmentation of Black communities and Black cultural landscapes. Landscapes link humans and culture, and as noted by the World Heritage Center of UNESCO, they describe cultural landscapes as cultural when they, quote, show the human interaction with the environment and the presence of tangible and intangible cultural values in the landscape. As we know, the southeastern United States has many layers of human history consisting of numerous and overlapping cultural influences, historical events and movements, and economic systems whose influence reaches far beyond the geophysical boundaries. So this started with resource use by prehistoric peoples to complex land management structures by various Native American tribes to the arrival of European settlers whose subsequent, quote, conquest of the New World led to the plantation kingdom based on large-scale monoculture of crops such as cotton, rice, sugarcane, and tobacco. So persons that were enslaved on these plantations were intricately tied to the land through both forced agricultural labor and subsistence gardening to supplement meager rations, and these ancestral experiences continue to influence the values, goals, and identities of Black landowners today. The ability of Black Americans to own land and fully utilize its resources is an ongoing challenge, and racial dynamics are deeply embedded in the landscape of the Southeastern United States today. We found during our research with landowners several themes. As I said, one, the importance of family history, which is literally and figuratively embedded in the landscape. Two, the ways that religious beliefs guide their understanding of land and their role as stewards. And three, the implications of land ownership to the broader community. So as we know, I think we can kind of skim through this. We know what heirs property is and why it can be a problem. It can inhibit asset building, land management, and limit participation in programs. But when talking to people, we found that it also presented opportunities in ways that help people connect with family members, document family history, develop visions for the land, and come together with other family members, and also create opportunities for future generations. So this research was conducted through two main projects, one funded by the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities and the U.S. Forest Service, and the other, the USDA Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. And these are both kind of research and outreach programs to learn more about what kind of obstacles people face with retaining land ownership and also how to build assets through sustainable forest management. So again, our qualitative interviews, we work through partner organizations because people have very good reason to be wary of people coming asking questions about their land. We try to conduct these interviews on or near the land because being out there actually triggers a lot of memories and sentimental attachments to land that you wouldn't necessarily get otherwise. We ask a lot of open-ended questions, allowing people to just talk at will about what was important to them, capturing the exact phrasing, and then just seeing what emerged from those interviews themselves. And again, these are the three main elements that we found that came as important to people. Just again, the history of slavery and their legacy and current relationships with family members. A lot of people saw religion as an important guiding factor in their land management. They view land as a gift from God, and they have a responsibility to be good stewards of that land. And we found the role of churches and pastors as both social networks and also conduits of information about forestry and land retention. Community, we found people talked about a past community that was not as fragmented, where they had support systems in place. And people also are building new communities on family land. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So briefly, maintaining the cohesion of the family, honoring the struggles of enslaved ancestors, and carrying on family legacy are primary goals of keeping family land. The process of managing this land requires cooperation among and within generations, and the land binds people together through shared history. And when we asked people to recall some of their early memories of the land, a lot of people talked about subsistence and row crop farming and working in the field with other family members. They also talked about memories of roaming the land, being in the forests, referred to as the woods, places where children and adults hunted, fished, collect medicinal plants, and just spent time outside. And most people felt a very great responsibility to instill the value of the land in future generations and ensure that they also know its history. And a lot of people also spoke of the land as sacred. Prevailing cultural value among African Americans in the southeastern United States is religion. Most of the people we talked to were Christian, and they held, again, these interconnected notions that land is a gift from God and that families are entrusted by God to be good stewards of the land and its resources. And several people talked about how their religious beliefs influence their land management decisions. This could include resistance to traditional forestry practices, such as prescribed burning or planting. People said, nobody can manage it better than God, whereas other people definitely had different opinions about that and wanted to be good stewards and felt that, more traditional forestry practices were the best way to do that. Again, we saw churches and pastors as a conduit of information, as trusted, although we did hear some bad experiences that people had with other church members who offered to help them. So it's not universally a source of good help, but by and large it was. And we saw that pastors served as community leaders, and churches and religion bind together individuals, families, communities, and the divine. So beyond the ecological and economic imperialism that physically displaces minority groups around the world, there's also, among many Black Americans, a heavy sense of nostalgia for a community that has become fragmented through land loss, outmigration, and general assimilation into mainstream culture. Land ownership, from what we heard in our interviews, provides not only economic security that comes from the ability to be self-sufficient and to generate wealth from resources on the land, but also physical and emotional security resulting from being surrounded by family and other African American families. These contributed to a sense of economic security and physical safety and a sense of community. We found that a lot of people were speaking actively of ways to use their land to create new communities focused on supporting other African Americans in various ways. So some people saw it as a self-sustaining resource, a potential safe place. A lot of these visions were grounded in religion as well. And these visions for newly created communities based on faith and shared cultural values demonstrate the links between community, religious faith, and the landscape. So just to bring it back briefly to heirs property, again, most of these visions require clear title and resolving heirs property issues. This happens on a lot of different levels, from policy level, government and non-governmental agencies and organizations, through communities, churches, and peer-to-peer social networks. And again, we saw people talking about creating opportunities for new communities on Black-owned land. So the Uniform Partition Heirs Property Act briefly includes 3 significant areas of reform. First, it allows heirs who want to retain land to be able to buy out the fractional interest of other heirs who petition the court for the forced sale of the property. Second, sale on an open market instead of at auction, which helps land speculators from forcing sales at greatly reduced land prices. And third, this is the part that, that our research focused on. It states that the court must consider not only economic, but also social, cultural, and historic value of the land, as well as the impact on occupants' use of property in the ultimate decision to sell or to parcel it out. So much of what we've done is documenting those intangible aspects of the culture that are embedded in the landscape. And as you can see, a lot of work has been done in the Southeast on this policy issue as well. So again, during our research, we visited a lot of Black land holdings, residential, farmland, forest land, which are geophysical and ecological spaces where social, political, cultural, and economic worlds intersect. They also serve as symbolic bridges between past and the future, and where the past, which is often painful, is being both honored and renegotiated in ways that aim to create new opportunities for the future. And as the title of a recent book suggests, Black Landscapes Matter. Thank you so much.
Okay. Oh, am I muted? No. Hey, thanks, Sarah. So I think that was nice. So we have 5 minutes for Q&A. And I think there are some questions on Q&A. Let me start from there. So let me start with the last question first. So Sharona is asking to the panel members, John, Sarah, and Noah, I will request you to unmute yourself so that it is easy for everybody. Right, so Sharona is asking, do you have any thoughts on the extent of heirs property as an issue outside of the Southeast? Also, what do you see as the applications of your research to other regions of the US like Northeast? I anticipate similarities, but some key divergence as well, and would love to hear your thoughts. So I think I will start with John, because I can see his raised finger, not hand. So yeah, John, let's go.
Well, I would just say that, the history of rural Black ownership is largely confined to the South. So we find much more of that in the South than other places, although there are other places where landowners face the same issues, whites in rural Appalachia, Hispanic folks in a variety of places. I think I would mention to Shorna, given that I know you're in New York, is that an incredible percentage of our people we interviewed had spent part of their lives in New York City, often Brooklyn. And we have done some exploratory things to talk to people in New York, and I think there are unexploited opportunities to meet people in New York who have land in the South and to help make those connections in the future.
Sarah, Noah, you want to add to anything? No? So also, just to let you know, guys, Dr. Shalhaz with colleagues in Boston, or Massachusetts, actually, Amherst, they've just recently published a paper. I think, John, it was in
Journal of Forestry.
Journal of Forestry, where they have analyzed what is a percentage of forest land which is there under the minority ownership. So, as we know, data is not very strong, but still it gives you good idea that where is the land or percentage of land under what kind of ownership. So I will encourage all of you to look at that paper, because I just sent that paper to somebody because they just came back to me like 3 days back. Interesting paper for sure. Thanks. So John, the other question definitely, which is very close to my heart, is that how do we make forestry more attractive to African-American landowners, especially with those landowners who have small acreages?
Well, we have actually written, there's a paper on that more from the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Project in the Journal of Forestry, 2018. I think I can try to put the link up later, but I really think it's a process. The first thing they need is not necessarily to become involved in a conservation program. They need someone to listen to them, to find out what they want, and then they also need to meet providers that can help to let them know of their options, and they often need to work with other family members. And it helps just a tremendous amount to meet other landowners like them who are engaged. And that, I know Joe Hamilton mentioned the Woodlands Advocate program in South Carolina is like a peer-to-peer learning where landowners who already have some experience go out and talk to landowners that don't have an experience. That's just probably the best way that you can do that, especially if it's backed up with some technical assistance and some financial assistance.
Okay, good. So I think I will take 2 more questions in the interest of time, but I will also encourage all the panelists to basically reply these questions whenever they can, so as to make sure that people have their answers with them. Now, there is a question from, actually it is more like a comment from Deborah Butler, that I think that goes to Noah, that a healthy ecosystem, including non-managed land, is essential to forest health. The burden of supporting swamps and wetlands can be accounted for as an operational expense on the balance sheet, capitalist, not environmental construct. So Noah, what do you think about these issues?
So I'm going to try to address the question I think that is in there. And I just want to clarify first, when I referred to our non-timberland, wetlands, open water, pasture, hardwoods as a burden, I specifically was referring to it as a tax burden in the sense that we're not generating income from that land. right? We're not generating income from wetlands, for example, but we still have to pay taxes on it. And I agree, you want a diversity of land covers on healthy land. And I think the point that I was trying to make, and maybe it got lost in there, is that good forest management, right, should allow a property owner to maintain other land cover types. That's the idea. We can cover all of our taxes with good forest management, which is going to allow you then to recreate on your property. It's going to allow you to practice conservation on your property. It's going to allow you to engage in traditional cultural practices on your property. And if you're not engaged in good forest management in the forested areas, I think there's a risk that you're not able to meet that property tax burden and that the land could be lost. And I think once forest land is lost from the current owners, from the current family who owns it, there's a risk that it gets converted into something else. It's converted into development, into row cropping or pasture, and that forest is lost. So that's kind of what I was getting at, not saying that wetlands is a burden in a general sense, but specifically a tax burden because it's not income generating.
Okay, good. So I think I can take one more question, and it looks like people are having some technical difficulties, but do not worry, you will have recordings, you will have PowerPoint slides, and you will have all the papers that I just discussed over an email once we are done for today. Okay, give me 1 week and you will have all the things, no problems on those lines. That's the whole idea of doing this conference. Okay, so I don't see any big question here apart from some how to get recordings and all those things. So that should not be a problem. So I think I personally would like to thank again Noah, John, and Sarah for all their time and efforts. And now we are moving into our second sub-session of the session where Jim is going to talk about heirs property on Indian lands. And if you don't know, Jim is a program officer at Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And when I talked to him and when he told me about all the complications that come when you're talking about heirs property on Indian land, then I thought that will be fascinating to know, not as a researcher, as a faculty who always tries to know new things, but also for all of us who work on heirs property and do not have any idea about Indian lands and how these issues are as relevant as Indian lands than what lands we are most familiar to. So Jim, I saw you somewhere on my big list. Okay, I can see you. And I think you can share your screen and then we can take it from there.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, my name is Jim Wabandato and I work for the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. I am a citizen of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, which is located in the western part of the state of Michigan, along Lake Michigan. My people are river and lake people, so fishing and hunting, using the forest resources has been a critical and important part of our history. As I had mentioned, I work for the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. It's a public nonprofit based in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul. It has been in existence since 2002. Let me go ahead and get the presentation going. Here we go. Well, the trouble is, there we go. So let me share my screen here. Okay. So the Indian Land Tenure Foundation was formed in 2002. It was started to address Indian land issues. So the easiest way to look at it is our mission. The mission is to restore to Indian ownership and management all lands within the original treaty reservation boundaries. That's a pretty broad scope. In order to accomplish that, we have specific strategies that we are addressing through that. With economic opportunity, we're looking to help tribes with land acquisition, buying back their reservations that may have been lost. We're also strengthening cultural awareness. using land as a way for that connection to take place. Specifically, one of the projects that I had worked on was to bring tribal youth from the Rosebud Reservation to a place in the Black Hills that we had helped the tribes acquire. And the reason for the importance of that location is that during the summer, the star map and the cosmology, part of the spirituality, all come together in a way that cannot be duplicated in a classroom or in other places. As we go through, I'll come back to education and legal reform, but we do provide resources for K-12 schools, continuing legal education for attorneys, and within the tribal land offices, we also have a program that allows for certification so that it standardizes practices and allows individuals who've gone through this certification to prove with that paper that they have knowledge to be effective in working with Indian land. Probably the place where we get our most recognition is in legal reform. We're looking to modify laws and help make things better for tribal communities. Now, when I do presentations, I often say if it has anything to do with Indian land, we probably have our fingers somewhere in the pie. And for our conference and for our conversation today, I would say that the National Indian Carbon Coalition is probably the best way to describe some of what we do. The National Indian Carbon Coalition, or NIC as we call it for short, is a partnership. The partnership is designed to help improve conservation in tribal communities, and we do that in a few different ways. One of which is to put together timber or forestry projects to capture carbon credits and then sell those carbon credits. One of the things in putting a project like that together for tribal communities is it's not very well known. Because it's not very well known, it's important to recognize that sovereignty comes into play, as well as these long-term commitments. Many carbon markets, especially the ones out of California, will often require 50, 75, 100-year horizons. And it's very difficult for a tribal community to commit to certain conservation practices on a very specific piece of land or in a region of the reservation, which for all intents and purposes is going to be 3 and 4 generations long. So we had looked at getting information out to tribal communities about what carbon markets are, but educating the carbon market, what tribal communities are like, and provide a way to increase liquidity. If you think of what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do for mortgages and allow banks to sell that to investors and then continue making original loans to us as homeowners, the possibility to do something with that, like that with the National Indian Carbon Coalition, can allow for our organization to be that debtor for the 100-year horizon, perhaps, and have enough tribal projects so that a community may only be committed to 5, 7, or even 10 years, something that's much more palatable to tribal leadership. The other reason in looking at this with the Indian Intertribal Agriculture Council is that there are federal USDA programs and other opportunities for those in active agriculture to participate in conservation methods. And we felt that this would be an important project to work in Indian country because there isn't anybody else doing it. I would shift gears here and give you a little bit greater context about what Indian land is like. It is different than airship property, but it does behave very similarly. So I'll go through what some of those are. There are primarily 3 types of properties that have an impact in Indian country. The first is fee land. Fee land is what you're used to. Anywhere else, you would have title, you'll register it with the county or township, pay taxes on it to the state and the local municipalities. but you have the ability to do with that property as you like. Restricted fee property is a special kind of land that the federal government set aside for parts of Indian country, so it's not universal. There are specific places like Oklahoma, which are much more in line to have restricted fee properties. What that is functionally is that the state will have a role, the federal government will have a role, and perhaps the tribe may have a role in how that ownership is managed and operated. Title is going to be like fee ownership. It stays with the individual who is named on the document, which does provide a little bit of extra flexibility in how you can handle your property. But again, the restrictions are going to make sure it isn't necessarily lost from Indian status or Indian ownership, but it also gives a greater role to the state perhaps to have an influence on jurisdiction on tribal reservations. And the last one is trust land. The key thing is to think of it as in trust for Indian landowners, whether that be the tribes or individuals. And so there are 3 types of trust property. I've included 4 because they're in agriculture especially is a sense that there are 4, but there are still technically 3, and I'll go through those. And as you can see on there, this is land that is actually held in title by the United States government, just like if you think of Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, all of those are federally owned lands. So when you're looking at Indian reservations, these are federally owned lands in trust for the tribe, may also be in trust for an individual within the reservation. And again, it starts to feel a little bit like individual ownership, but the tribe and the federal government have a role in that process. There is another kind of individual trust property that is not as well known, that is called a public domain. The key thing when Indians were getting land in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s were that some Indians were reservationless. What the federal government did is provide for public domain trust allotments. This is land that is held in trust for an individual and their descendants, but there is no particular tribe that has specific oversight. I'm working on a couple of reservations, as it were, with individuals who have trust land that is public domain. One of the difficulties that they face in not having a tribe that has outright jurisdiction over their Indian land is getting adequate services from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We will often hear inside my industry that the federal government, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, doesn't have enough resources to meet everybody's needs. And for those individuals who are public domain allotments, there is no tribe who can kind of twist arms or come to bat for them. So it is almost a disadvantaged status to have a public domain allotment. The last one, as I put on here, is called an assignment. If you think of long-term assignments, you're getting beneficial use for an extended period of time. And in the agricultural community that use assignments, what they're finding is it's gone from this generation to the next generation to the following generation. And over time, it starts to feel like that is owned by that particular family. But legally speaking, it is an assignment from the tribe to the family or to the individual. And again, going back to the trust relationship, land that is legally titled to the United States government. Property in Indian country, I know that we're talking about heirship land, and so this is probably where we could spend a little bit more time going through some of the federal schema, the different framework that will help you better understand how projects can work inside Indian country. An allotment is made to an individual I put in here that it's treaties and federal law. I think many people are familiar with the fact that there is a federal law that created the allotment process, but working inside the industry, I can tell you that federal law actually statutorily put that policy in place. My reservation, the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, was party to a treaty in 1836 with a number of tribal communities that created enough land acquisition to create the state of Michigan. But as that process evolved, there were a number of tribal members in my community who felt like they didn't have access to enough land, that the federal government created a second treaty in 1855. In that 1855 treaty, there was land that was individually allotted to families. Most of those are going to be anywhere from 40 to 160 acres. The mid 1850s, 1860s, you'll see certain treaties creating the allotment process in specific communities. But in 1887, the Dawes Allotment Act was passed. Colloquial speaking, we refer to it as the Dawes Act, and that created a uniform federal policy across the United States for allotments on reservations. There were several reasons to do that, primarily to pass out enough land for individuals. Again, if you're at 40 to 160 acres, there was bound to be additional acreage left over, which then was opened up to non-Indians to come onto the reservation. With both of those processes, and especially with the federal policy in 1887, it did place restrictions on alienation, meaning loss of ownership. I put yes but no on my slide because it did prohibit the sale and transfer of lands, but it didn't necessarily address loss through inheritance. And it also, because it was not able to be sold, for instance, in a traditional format, that's where our fractional ownership began. When I talk about the loss of through inheritance, family members may or may not have been able to become citizens of their tribal community. And as such, if they were to inherit it under state probate laws at the time, then it would have gone out of trust. Similarly speaking, even into the early 2000s, it wasn't uncommon, it was quite common, I should put it in the affirmative, it was quite common that fractionally owned Indian land would go out of trust to non-Indian spouses. That was a process that was remedied with the American Indian Probate Reform Act. That law was passed in 2004 and went into effect with all probates after June of 2006. And when I talk about fractional ownership and I talk about loss, it creates a major headache because you'll end up with quite a few different owners. To give you a sense of scale, I think some of the fractions when I've dealt with lands have been like 17 over 16,450 something. To see anything with 1 over 8 or 1 over 64 is actually quite uncommon. I think in serving the needs of Indian landowners, I could probably count on my 2 hands the number of people who have sole ownership over their Indian land. Most of the rest of these reservations that were allotted have highly fractionated ownership. And so when you see this 1/243 on the visualization, that's actually a pretty small fraction to you guys, but it's a large amount of ownership for a lot of the allotments that we deal with on a regular basis. Now, I had mentioned the fractional ownership, loss of inheritance. When you get into jurisdiction on Indian lands, it creates quite a headache. I mentioned the fiduciary relationship. So the Marshall Trilogy was a series of 3 court cases at the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1830s, especially with tribes in the in the Georgia and Arkansas, South Carolina, Florida area, the 5 civilized tribes as they used to be called. And what it did is it, through court action, created what were viewed as domestic dependent communities. So that was the beginning of the diminishment of tribal leadership on a large scale. It also introduced the concept of plenary power. In layman's terms, plenary power is the ability of the US Congress to create laws that regulate what happens within Indian reservation boundaries. One of the other aspects that came out of the trilogy and part of the allotment process is that Indians were considered incompetent to manage their own affairs. And because they could not manage their own affairs, it established this very clear line of a fiduciary relationship where the federal government is the owner and is supposed to be doing its actions in the best interest of the Indian land user. Now, I had mentioned this to get to the bureaucracy. There is statutory, regulatory, as well as case law that creates a hodgepodge of how things are going to apply with treaties, statutes, regulations, and case law, especially with the various appellate court districts. Unless it reaches the Supreme Court, we can have tribal communities operating under a different set of federal understanding than their cousins who are part of the same treaties perhaps, but may be physically located in what might be considered a different state. And so for our purposes, when you're looking at projects, the location of the tribe is more important than some of the other aspects because of its history. It may be under a different set of rules than other places. I can give you one quick example. In 1854, there were the Lake Superior Chippewa tribe. They passed land to the federal government in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. In the early 2000s, late 1990s, a tribe in Upper Peninsula of Michigan sued and eventually made its way through the appellate level that they did not have to pay property taxes, even if the land was no longer considered in trust. Because of how the treaty was drafted, their cousins, who are located in the state of Wisconsin, with Wisconsin surrounding them, did not have the same application because it is a different appellate court district, and therefore they are now working their own way through their own appellate system. So again, when you're looking at the checkerboarding of regulatory processes and the bureaucracies that apply, there are so many things that will change. One other fiduciary struggle I want to highlight for folks is what we consider the covered permanent improvement problem. What this was is a change in 2008 to the American Indian Probate Reform Act, and it created a separation. It divorced permanent structures from the real estate. In most places, a barn or a school would be considered part of the realty and therefore would transfer with ownership. It would be considered integral to that real estate. In Indian country, with this law, they changed the rules of the game and have now separated those permanent improvements from the realty. It is possible in Indian country on allotments for me as a landowner to give one of my daughters 6 acres and to give the other daughter the house, thereby splitting ownership of what for most people would be considered one piece of property. So I just want to highlight that that exists. Because of the slide, if anyone has questions, we can come back to that. So with mixed authority and jurisdiction, you can see this long list of everyone who is a stakeholder in the process. And as stakeholders, there are a lot of factors. Everyone you can see on this list is going to be invested in the outcome and feels that they are critical decision makers. And so that tends to set a very contentious process in place for tribal projects. To get to specifics so you can get a better sense of what's going on, when it comes to leasing, there is Part 162. I highlight this and so that you can see there is also agricultural, residential, business, wind, and solar resources are all covered, as well as the general provisions of what makes up a lease. If you were interested, you can see Part 162. I've included the link. This is actually a combination of what happened with the American Indian Probate Reform Act, as well as Part 162. And it sets out a scale for decision-making on fractional or highly fractional ownership. So if there are 5 or fewer owners, for all intents and purposes, you're looking at getting 100% of the landowners needed to agree to an action, whether it be a lease, whether it be a right-of-way, or a sale, before anything can take place. But because we're also dealing with highly fractional ownership, they did want to provide a way for communities and for the federal government specifically to be able to keep progress moving ahead. So if there are 20 or more owners, then you're looking for the largest percentage. We kind of call it the 50 plus 1 vote. So if I've got 106 owners and I've got 3 of them who can cover about 45% of the ownership, I need those 3 and then however many more owners to get plus, 50, exactly 50%. And then you can certainly have a say. I'm not going to suggest that we'll always allow those owners to specifically make decisions, but it can certainly give them much more authority to stop things that they don't want to have happen on their land. So when we're looking at regulatory, we've got leasing. I know it's a close cousin, but it is important to realize that there are agricultural resource management plans. This section and the next section are more appropriately done at a tribal level, but the tribal self-determination through an agricultural resource management plan ties a 10-year agricultural plan with their integrated resource management plan. It sets the rules and guidelines that not only control what is going to be done by the tribe within their jurisdiction, but with an approved ARMP, the federal government is also required to comply with those standards as well. So all federal actions will be compliant with their ARMP. Let's see here. I think it's probably gonna be too much of a hassle to go back and forth yet, but once I get toward the end, I'll show you what some of these documents look like. I also want to highlight for our conversation today specifically that there is the capacity through the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act for tribal communities to put in place their forest management plan. This is enacted and managed at the tribal level. One of the major actors, especially in the Pacific Northwest, with forestry activities is the Intertribal Timber Council. And they actually have a publication that I've linked here and hope to show you shortly that will give you a sense of what working on forestry in Indian country might look like. So what does this all mean in our sense of conversation? This is one of the slides I usually include. And I show it to you because it's very clear where the reservation boundaries are. And you can see, if you're able to scale in close enough, on the kind of central west side, says Scottsdale Community College. So this is Mesa and Scottsdale coming right up against the Salt River Pima Maricopa Reservation. And you can see on the west, it's small city lots right up to the reservation. That road separates the reservation from the city of Scottsdale. And so when I'm talking about the underdevelopment of tribal communities through bureaucratic processes, through limitations, this is one of the easiest ways to see what does that mean, because it's not, I mean, the reservation is right there. There shouldn't necessarily be beyond resource use considerations why there wouldn't be more economic activity available to the tribe and to the tribal members. When you're looking on here, one of the reasons that Denny's shows up is I had a meeting with a tribal family on an allotment, and that family took their allotment and put in a couple of strip malls, and is doing exceedingly well with financial gain through using their allotment land. But they do put together a way for the family to manage that through one particular individual as the president and others. So with fractional ownership, it does inhibit use. Tribal planning and active land management are going to be critical and successful to the use of Indian lands beyond what the individuals may do. And so I'd like to think of it in terms of information plus participation equals self-determination for allotment landowners. So the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, we do quite a bit of education and outreach. I mentioned the Lessons of Our Land is the name of the actual website. The Lessons of Our Land is an effort that we have to provide small scale lessons on various issues related to Indian land for schools. My colleague, Nicholas Emmons, manages that program. He has been doing professional development and has also been showing teachers how to use this in the classroom so that it can be used anywhere at any time. We did have quite a bit of uptick in its usage last spring when teachers were scrambling to find ways that they could teach online. I am actually part of a larger outreach program. I deliver presentations in tribal communities regularly on issues related to ownership and management, helping to illuminate rights and opportunities for landowners so that they can better use that land to advance their own interests. But we do also work with a number of other collaborators who provide direct education and technical assistance. I've got a slide at the end that will highlight some of those partners and collaborators. So when I'm looking at direct action, I'm talking about what we often say is be the change that you want to see. If you are actively creating a vehicle, if you're working with your cousins and your family members on joint ownership and management of your land, you're much more likely to be successful in getting it actively used for agricultural purposes. You could put it together for commercial gain, as I showed you on that map. And so it's important to be active in making your world a reality. I also want to highlight for participation is related to leadership and advocacy. I believe firmly that individual community members need to be working through their community action as leaders in nonprofits, in leaders in getting messages put across. One of the issues that probably gets the most attention in Indian country for community action are the water protectors. They were at Standing Rock during the Keystone Pipeline issue. They're now still very active in northern Minnesota and northern Michigan through 2 other pipeline issues. But there are other ways that community members can start nonprofits to help advance their community's interests. Advocacy is probably one of the most difficult things for individuals to be involved with, because when you're looking at participating in public forums or submitting written testimony, it's hard to stand out when you've got somebody like the Indian Land Tenure Foundation who can come in and knows some of the people asking for testimony. We find that we will recommend people start landowner associations, join groups that represent the interest of individual landowners, because these organizations allow for them to be heard. And the Indian Land Tenure Foundation regularly works with another one called the Indian Land Working Group, and they try to make sure that individuals get that voice heard and are allowing those issues to be heard, not from the tribal context, not from the federal context, but from the people who are going to use the land. The last piece I put in here is to conduct research or contribute data to further understanding of issues. Especially in Indian country, we do not have a lot of information out there. When organizations are trying to put together testimony, when they're trying to better understand an issue, you need to get information from individuals. And so I often recommend that ag producers get in touch with people who are trying to help them better understand issues and, again, change the tone. So I'll say I'm available for questions, and I want to make sure that people see who some of these other organizations are. The Intertribal Agriculture Council provides direct technical assistance to agricultural producers and tribal communities. They also provide access to capital. The Intertribal Timber Council is an organization of a number of tribes in the Pacific Northwest advancing their interests, but they also have the ability to influence. The Indian Nations Conservation Alliance, INCA, meets regularly. They serve tribal communities, but they also invite individuals to be involved. Oh, I forgot to change one of my links. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior. I'm hopeful you can find that one. I've neglected to get that changed in my slide. And then the U.S. Forest Service has their Office of Tribal Relations. OTR has been an effective way for USDA to be in touch with individuals. So let me go back here and show you those other. Let's see.
So Jim, we have 2 minutes or so, okay?
Yeah. So go ahead, I'm available for questions. I'm just gonna cycle through those so that people can see them.
Yeah, so I think we have a question in chat window. Nicole Wilson is trying to figure it out. This is the link that you refer to, or is something else is there? The link is www.lessonsofourland.org.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, that's good. I don't see any question on Q&A. So in case you have something you want to ask, this is the right time, because after that we will break for lunch and we'll come back exactly at 1. So any questions for Jim? So Jim, personally, thanks for sharing all these things. As I said before, I never had any idea that what is the situation. And after your presentation, I realized that not only situation is bad, but boy, it's very complicated.
Yes, I often say that that it allows me to know that I have job security for the rest of my career. I'm in my late 40s, and this is not an issue that we're going to be able to resolve within my professional career.
Yeah, we need more people like you who are working quite a bit. And I think you guys can learn from what we did here in South, thanks to the initial funding that came from US Endowment, which basically started building awareness. And my friend at that time, Alan McGregor, was basically started all these things. So how we came together as a team, and definitely over a number of 6-7 years now, we have helped quite a bit of minority landowners to solve their heirs property and also start doing sustainable forestry. I think there is a lot of scope on Indian lands doing something like this with the help of your organization and other organizations like you. It's a vast opportunity, and definitely it speaks to forestry without any doubt.
Hey, Puneet, this is Thomas Mitchell. Can I have a quick question?
Yes, Thomas, go ahead, please.
So, thanks, Jim. Awesome presentation. So I often come across scholars and others who conflate the fractionalized property problem in Indian country with non-Indian country, right? And they assume that they're the same, right? So obviously there are some similarities, but there's oftentimes different manifestations, but not always, right? Because, you know, if you're in a fee state, then it's, you know, very similar. So what do you see? So I kind of make that point to people who just kind of make that assumption, and I have to like separate it. But with that perspective, you know, do you see there being opportunities for people working on fractionalized ownership in Indian country with those who are working outside? Obviously, we can do this in terms of academic research, but maybe on policy, law and policy work. So just because I think that's often confused and it's conflated, that doesn't mean that there's not necessarily opportunities to collaborate. So any thoughts you have on that?
I think some of the vehicles to help landowners advance their interests as a group are ways that we can work together very well. I think when it comes to direct solutions, it gets a little harder because, as I laid out, the different regulatory, statutory, and treaty frameworks. But this is actually the second airship conversation that I've been a part of. They had one at the Mitchell Hamlin Law School 2 springs ago.
That I did with you.
Yes, and so that one, as you'll recall, we talked about airship, but Indian land, because it deals with fractional ownership and you're trying to get landowners to see a common good, I think that there are ways that we can kind of combine some of those practical resources.
Oh,
Great. Thank you.
thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Jim. I think there are a lot of questions after your presentation, Jim, and let me start taking them. In the meantime, I would like to announce that if you want to stay and be part of this Q&A, you are most welcome. Otherwise, you can take a break. We will start the next session at 1 o'clock. So it is up to you how you want to move forward. But Jim, there are a lot of questions, and I will repeat them for you.
Sure.
For example, Laura German, she is my own colleague at University of Georgia. She is asking that it seems that collective ownership has been key to land retention for tribes. Yet for heirs property, it seems that everyone is emphasizing individualized title. How to make sense of this contradiction?
I think your colleague makes a good point. When you're looking at protecting that Indian status, it is much easier in the community standard because I see the same thing with individual allotment landowners, that they feel this is our land. You know, who in the heck is the tribe to tell us what to do with our land? And so I think that allotments do probably experience some of the same individualism that you're seeing in airship lands. I would say in probably about 3 or 4 different projects that I've directly worked with families who are trying to use their land productively, that is the perspective that we're seeing. One of them happens to be public domain, so they don't feel like there is a tribe. And it's interesting to watch as things trickle along that they're very stout in saying that there is no tribe and nobody can tell us what to do. But yet when they get into fights with the county, for instance, over water rights out west, the nearby tribe gets pulled in because the nearby tribe has actually negotiated some of those things with the county. And so they're able to kind of grab onto that. But I think when it comes to daily use, they want to exercise the same independence that you're seeing in airship lands.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question comes from James. He's asking, are there any protection efforts in Virginia?
I can't think of anybody that sticks out offhand in Virginia, no.
Okay, thanks, Jim. The next question comes from Matthew. He's asking, is there still talk of the land treaties that were not honored by the US government?
Can you repeat that?
So Matthew is asking, is there still talk of the land treaties which were not honored by the US government?
I think a lot of the treaties have been kind of not honored here and there. It goes back to the plenary power. If Congress takes unilateral action, and I'm specifically meaning unilateral action, it is easy to sidestep some of those things. The tribes can try and use the federal court system, but again, just like we see with violence against women, where non-Indians, or even in business transactions where non-Indians will say, well, geez, why would I go through the tribal court system? They're going to rule on behalf of the tribe. Tribes feel similarly in the federal court system because they're fighting against the federal government in the federal government's court system. So I don't know that it's an unknown. I think everybody knows that that exists, and it's just kind of an unspoken thing. Then how do we proceed within that framework? There's no easy solution, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. That's the thing. It's really complicated the way history is and the way things are. And also, so Steve is basically asking a question that I also wanted to ask. What is behind you? It looks like really hard. Yeah.
That is buffalo hide that was commissioned that did not get used in a contest. Different buffalo hide got used instead. And so let me get out of the right way. It's actually representative of reverse manifest destiny. So manifest destiny being the federal policy where they, God-given right to go out west and take over and establish the United States. So this is part of that story of returning the buffalo. And highlights the railroad's use in getting rid of the buffalo.
Oh, okay, got it. That's the message here. Okay, Jim, we have one more, I will not say question, an observation from James Patterson. And the comment is the federal government claiming to owe the land which occurred by violence strips tribes and the indigenous people from exercising their property right. So do you have any thoughts on those lines?
That's a tough one. One of the ways that we're looking to get outside of the box, as it were, is to see if there may be a way for us to create a indigenous title. Generally speaking, how that would play out, when the state of Michigan, state of Minnesota were admitted into the union, part of that legislative process, part of that executive process was to transfer lands to that state. And so that's where, again, you register your ownership for your house, your farm, your timber stand with the county. That's a subdivision of the state. One of the things that we think that we're going to work on over the next half a dozen years is to see how we might put in tribal title or indigenous title. They have done that in a very minor sense in certain parts of Canada. And so we've been talking to the individuals doing that process there, such that all lands within a reservation would be titled by that tribe. So if I look at, say, Pine Ridge, one of the very well-known, or even Navajo, but Pine Ridge is better because it has a lot more fractional ownership and a lot of non-Indian ownership within the boundaries. If you were to follow indigenous title, it would get rid of the checkerboarding and the jurisdictional issues by putting all lands within the Pine Ridge Reservation titled by the Pine Ridge. And as non-Indians, you would need to accept that jurisdiction of the tribe. It's very common when you look at that. I can live in the state of Minnesota, but buy land in Michigan. So even though I'm a Minnesota resident, I have to accept and abide by the rules of the state of Michigan for my land that I own within that jurisdiction. So that would be one way that we would potentially see relieving communities of that federal ownership status. And in essence, you would have a Pine Ridge fee land that you would have title to, whether it be Puneet, Jim, or a tribal member.
Right. Okay, Jim. So thank you so much for your time. This was very interesting, and I think this is a good start where we have started thinking about heirs property issues on Indian lands. And thanks to you, I think definitely we will go somewhere from here, as I always so far. So thank you so much again for your time and thoughtful presentation. Very interesting.
You're welcome. I appreciate this opportunity to share our knowledge, and certainly with the presentation, it will allow you guys to get a hold of me if you have additional questions, but I please invite people to look at those resources. They will certainly be able to address the forestry much, much better than I can.
Yeah, and I'm sure we went a little bit over time, but I think that's a time well spent. No problems on those lines. Thank you so much. Again, Jim, we are in touch.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Take care. So.
Bye.